Live. Everywhere. On netrootsradio.com. David Waldman. Kagro. In the morning. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is Monday. It is January 6th, but it is 2025. And therefore, we're not watching a riot form outside of the Capitol. At least 4 years ago, we weren't watching it quite yet. They were instead storming through or demanding to be let into the ellipse with their weapons. And Donald Trump was happy to let them there because, of course, he knew that they weren't there to hurt him, which raises a lot of questions yet left unanswered. Okay. It is a different picture outside today in Washington, D.C., in the Washington, D.C. area, and a snowy one for much of the East Coast. I guess I don't know how far north or south, for that matter, the nasty weather actually extends. We just sort of happen to be in the targeted range here. So had this been the prevailing weather conditions, 4 years ago, I don't know they would have been able to pull off the whole insurrection. Can you imagine just a little bit of weather getting in the way and changing the course of history, as opposed to horrific corruption and theft of the Supreme Court, for instance, taking over and stealing or changing the course of history. I imagine we'll spend some time looking back on that and looking back on the mistakes that were made in between then and now, and catching up on, well, there are other things, of course, in the news, and but that's very much on our mind today because the anniversary is coming up, and wow, what a mistake. So lots of looks back at how poorly we collectively, I guess, handled the whole thing, and collectively meaning many of the other people for whom we might not claim any responsibility, including, of course, Republicans who normalized the whole thing, media members who also likewise normalized the whole thing eventually, though it looked for all the world for some of these guys that for at least for the next week, they were willing to spend a week condemning this thing, or perhaps a little bit longer. And of course, corporate donors who for the space of a week or a month insisted that they wouldn't be giving any money to the campaigns of Republicans who voted not to certify the election results from various states or any state. And then that fell by the wayside. And now, of course, many of these corporate leaders insisting, pushing one another out of the way to give $1 million to Donald Trump personally for his inauguration fund, which, as we've explained, because there are no disbursement requirements for reporting, that money can go directly into his pocket. I'm sure he's got more sophisticated arrangements for it, and in fact, I think somewhere prominent in pocket from late last night, there should be some information about that, although, yeah, now I'm not seeing it all that far up at the top. Oh, there we are. Okay, a Forbes magazine reporting on Trump breaking tradition. That's how they're putting it, by redirecting inaugural swag funds to his PAC. That's just one of the income streams from the inauguration, but that I guess traditionally merchandise sales of inauguration, branded, I guess, materials got plowed back into the inaugural committee and helped pay for the celebrations, if that's what you want to call them today. But instead, this time, wow, I can't believe it, breaking tradition and redirecting those sales revenues to himself. Well, not himself personally, but to his PAC, but it being a leadership PAC and him not running for any office, presumably. I don't know whether that's really presumed or not. In the future, he's able to use it, as many leaders do, as a lifestyle PAC, and it's all about lifestyle for Donald Trump. So lots to catch up on that front. Nothing changes governmentally today. That doesn't happen until the 20th, of course, when we find out how serious, or for that matter, non-serious but intentional, Donald Trump really is about the various things he's going to do on day one. All right, let's, I don't know, I'll answer the phone. Why not? I'm getting some interesting new, I must have had some sort of software update or operating system update on the Mac without my knowledge, and I'm getting all kinds of notifications for things that just usually... I understand that these things happen. I don't need an alert telling me that Skype is ringing. I mean, Skype is ringing. But at any rate, Skype is ringing, and it's ringing with Greg Dworkin, who can tell us about weather conditions and snow totals in Connecticut and other things. Good morning, Greg. How are you?
Alert. This is a Skype call.
Yes, it's a Skype call.
This is a public service announcement. If this were an actual Skype call, you would have been notified by the same people who notified you that this is a Skype call.
How come I'm not being asked to rate the notifications that I'm getting? Yeah, that might happen. Oh, good. I'll give them zeros. All right, let's begin. Now, first of all, how is the weather?
So I'm going to talk about some other stuff besides January 6th and then get to that.
But that's what today is.
I know, but if we don't talk about other things, we never will, because January 6th could occupy the next 10 days.
Yes.
There's just so much to say about it.
Yeah, that's true.
The thing is that when it comes to the inauguration and corporations folding in advance, giving up, and giving $1 million to Trump just because, and personally sometimes it's like Zuckerberg personally and Bezos personally, give this money in addition to their corporations doing it. But it's so unexpected that corporations would be transactional that it's not even disappointing. I mean, I would put it in the same category as Republican Hill cowardice.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was a surprise.
Oh, my God, they actually said one thing and then voted a different way. That's never happened before since like 15 minutes ago.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It was, I guess, a surprise that there was any even declaration of intent from corporate donors. We're really going to intervene in this and do something. All right.
Well, it's fun but meaningless and people are doing this. One of the things they do on January 6th is make lists of all the things people said on January 7th, 2020, by conservatives, Eric Erickson, et cetera.
Yeah.
And now where they stand. Duh.
Too. Yeah.
Right? I mean, at the time, everybody recognized it for what it is, and now you're rewriting history because the other guy won, and you want to stay in his good graces because you're either afraid or you're afraid and you want something.
Yeah.
The fear doesn't go away, but sometimes it's added, and I want something.
Okay. True. And I get it.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's hardly surprising. What I want to start with, though, is some observations about New Orleans and Houston, that is to say the car that blew up and the terror attack on Bourbon Street.
Okay.
And one of the notable things is
Vegas.
You tend to ignore a very common thing that happens in New Orleans. And that is something bad happens, but you have to make sure it doesn't interfere with tourism.
Yes.
Because this is a capitalist country. So this is an MSNBC opinion piece by Jarvis DeBerry, which, is interesting to me because it's unusual. You don't usually see it written. After New Year's Day terrorist attack, New Orleans tries to balance tourism and grief. Less than 36 hours after Wednesday's attack and before we knew the names of all the victims, New Orleans reopened Bourbon Street to pedestrians.
Yeah.
Now, whether you want sparkly shoes or whether you want jazz and heritage and anything else, you're going to have the most fun in New Orleans when you're outside and surrounded by crowds of people because that's the way the place works.
Yes.
And so one of the reasons New Year's Day terrorist attacks in places like Bourbon Street are so deadly is because it exploits one of the city's best traits. People happily gathering in large numbers outside. This is after 3 a.m. on January 1st. People tend to forget it was the middle of the night.
Oh, yeah. I mean...
or sort of the early morning.
Because it kind of doesn't make a difference in a way for them.
But they were out partying, and they were going to party till dawn.
Yeah.
And now the fact is, this guy was intent to kill people. And apparently he had improvised explosives, 2 of them at least. And the only reason he didn't set them off is he was shot dead by the cops.
That's a good reason.
Yeah. Well, it's hard to, set things off after you're dead. But, that was his intent. It's notable that, as he writes, the rush to clean up the city, pave the potholes, fix the traffic lights, and New Orleans' Walk of Fame on Canal Street, the heartless sweep of people living in tents beneath the bridges who can't afford rent in the Big Easy because the Super Bowl's coming. Concerns about what's best for New Orleanians doesn't motivate any of these projects.
No, although, I guess that's the excuse. Well, we're bringing in revenue and jobs, something.
Right.
But apparently not enough.
And then, of course, they have the New Orleans tradition of jazz bands at funeral.
Yes.
More than 15 years ago, he writes, when I was a columnist for the Times-Picayune, I attended the funeral of a 2-year-old whose father chose to slit his throat rather than pay the $4,000 he owed in back child support.
Okay.
And the pastor of the church, who would observe a brass band at a prayer vigil the night before, said to the congregation, I think we start dancing a little too soon.
Wow, yeah. Okay.
But in the present moment, when residents' emotions are the most raw they've been since Hurricane Katrina, and again, you got to appreciate how people felt in Boston, for example, with the marathon bombing, or Newtown.
Sure.
It doesn't feel like New Orleans is choosing to dance, but being made to dance, lest it lose the patronage of those who come demanding a good time.
Okay.
And, I think that's a really interesting and important discussion to have.
I think so. I mean, I don't know, like an entire city that's like contractually obligated not to mourn, even though that's some of what they're famous for. Well, no, do it this way, and dance for us.
His whole point there is, New Orleans ought to mourn the way it wants, but it's not choosing the way it wants. The NFL is. And that's not right.
Yeah, very powerful organization, the NFL. I remember when the NBA was president of this country.
Yeah. I remember when it was NASCAR, but we have these rotating elections, and that's what democracy is all about.
Right. Peaceful transition of power between sports. I believe sports betting is set to become president in a few days.
Yeah. Well, the important thing in sports is that Paige Bucker's knee injury isn't all that serious at UConn. So.
Okay. Good update.
Philadelphia Inquirer, Will Bunch writes, Las Vegas, New Orleans, and the ugly truths America won't talk about. I mistakenly said Houston. You corrected me. Thank you. A deadly U.S. New Year's Day inspires demagogues with little talk about root causes of PTSD, misogyny, and unchecked male rage. We don't really treat a lot of this stuff as seriously as we should. When fierce bolts of lightning and a freak winter storm were caught on video striking the U.S. Capitol at 5:36 p.m. on New Year's Eve, social media's people said the New Year's going to be biblical. And those nervous jokes stopped just a few hours into New Year's Day, as the 1960s radical H. Rap Brown famously described political violence as American as cherry pie, and arrived long before the first hungover scrambled eggs of 2025. And, of course, he's referring to the French Quarter. It took stunned officials in Louisiana tourist Mecca hours to clear all the bodies, let alone get an accurate count of the dead. 14, or the deadliest attack on U.S. soil in 15 months. And meanwhile, the shocks kept coming when a Tesla Cybertruck exploded car bomb style at the front door of Trump's high-rise hotel. Since we talked about it last, what's come to light is the manifesto from the guy who basically killed himself.
Yes.
Who said, he really would like to purge all the Democrats. I think that's sort of kind of important.
Yeah, and they left that out of the first round of reporting on this.
Well, I don't think they knew. They had to go in the car, get his phones, break into the phones, find his messages, et cetera, or however they did it. It took some time. Now that we know that ought to be like front page news.
Yeah. Oh, no, I think there were some complaints over. I didn't watch that closely, the unraveling of the manifesto news, but the people who were on top of it, where the complaint was that the mainstream traditional media sort of reported it as well. He had family problems, PTSD, and he had general complaints about the state of government, and it took a day or two before people said, well, the complaint about the state of government was that they weren't purging Democrats, and that they ought to.
That's number one.
Yeah, see, now that should have led.
Is the New Orleans attacker was born in Texas and is a veteran, and there hasn't been enough pushback against Trump's claim that, you see, this proves my point about immigrants. Right. You know, Trump is taking the typical traditional Republican approach to taxes. Economy's good, time to cut taxes. Economy's bad, time to cut taxes.
Yeah.
You know, and so he does the same thing with immigration and gets no pushback from places like the Washington Post, who stifled a cartoon from a Pulitzer Prize-winning cartoonist,
right,
Antelnes, who then quit and said, you can't do that. And their excuse was, well, you know, it was basically saying the same thing that we have columns and other things doing. So therefore it was repetitive.
What? Really?
As if newspapers have never done anything repetitive.
No,
as
that
if
never
adults
happens.
don't learn by repetition.
How though? Yeah.
Let me say that again. So, you know, the whole point of having a cartoonist is to let them do what they do.
Yes.
And if you're going to stifle it, then a lot of more people than before.
Yes, many.
Canceled their Washington Post subscriptions. And Telness now has a Substack.
That's something. The people who know the ins and outs of Substack and what it is that bothers them so much about it, I have a hard time articulating it, but because I don't know the ins and outs of how it works. But apparently there's something to be frowned on about the way Substack operates as well. I don't know that there's any alternative that's widely known.
Well, it offers more money to famous people.
I guess that's it.
Is the problem, but that's okay.
Yeah.
I mean, you know,
if that's all it is, then I guess
that's all it is.
All right,
and it's working.
That's always worked for me. I've always had less money than most people who are famous.
I figure,
Yeah.
Besides, we're obviously not in it for the money. If we were, we wouldn't be doing that.
Yes, we would have realized that a long time ago and got into it for some other reason or left it for something else.
I'm a blogger, for Christ's sake.
So, all right. Yeah, that resignation received a lot of attention. It was kind of interesting in a way. Like, I can't diminish what happened there and what she's giving up by resigning too much. Although I did kind of wonder, like, well, I guess they just exist in separate worlds. Like me, you and I, we see sometimes the Washington Post as this monolith, and I'm guessing she just didn't have very much to do with the ins and outs of the editorial board and their decisions, and for instance, their prohibition from
their new
publishing
from Britain who have issues. So you start
out
with,
really
okay, I already don't trust them.
Yeah.
Then they did this. Forget it. There's no goodwill.
Yeah. I kind of wondered, like, should she have been, on alert when they didn't publish the endorsement? Well, she probably was. But then again.
It's not her endorsement.
Yeah.
This is her work.
Right.
I mean, there's clearly difference.
Yeah. It's just weird. Like, okay, I didn't know how to feel about it. On the one hand, like, sure,
Pretend you're at work in a corporation.
Yeah. No,
Hospital,
I don't want to do that.
Yeah. And it's a different division that just had an issue. You're going to quit?
No. Yeah.
But when it's
I
yours,
love quitting.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's essentially it. And although that can also be viewed as, are you waiting for a leopard? I guess. They didn't eat your face.
It's not like I didn't know it was coming. It's not like I pretended it wasn't coming.
Now, ultimately, it's like
there's a time and a place and a red line, and they just crossed it because it's me. So bye.
Right. That's fine. I mean, the reality of the way real people work is like, even if you knew they'll definitely start coming for me, and this is definitely resignable, the real life situation takes over. All right, what would an exit look like? Where would I go? I start looking around for exits, and then you get attacked, and you say, well, now I have to go. But thankfully, I had a little bit of warning from the editorial board fiasco.
Right, and therefore I had Substack all set up.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was
so like after 35 seconds, here's my alternative, just so you know.
Now you know.
That suggests maybe she's thought about it.
Yeah. And rightly so, because it was right in front of her face.
Yep. Anyway, getting back to Will Bunch's piece here,
yes.
He says, we should also worry about America's powerful tendency for avoidance when it comes to the... Oh, don't apologize. I mean, the whole non sequitur thing is like why we do this.
Right.
Yeah, don't interrupt.
Right. Where were I? Where were I?
But we should also worry about America's powerful tendency for avoidance when it comes to the ugly truths about why such a seemingly prosperous nation is also so remarkably violent. H. Rap Brown got it right. The real reasons why mass murder keeps happening, the troubling overlaps with 2020 U.S. and world politics and what we can do about it. So 5 days later, it's clear the roots of this latest spasm aren't found in the deserts of Syria. Duh.
What?
Remember when I was complaining about that on the show? Everything is Syria. Everything is, no.
Okay. Yeah, we got our own problems.
But ingrained in the modern demons of American life in both our excessively militaristic culture, the overlapping crisis of male anger and rage arguably also put Trump back on top of the November election. Despite early speculation, these two guys didn't know each other, but their common bonds are striking, both like budget rentals.
Yeah, I guess.
Both men served in Afghanistan, the botched longest war in U.S. history that left the Taliban intact and in charge, even as it scarred the Americans who fought there. Both men were trained, and by the way, again, part of the wisdom of Joe Biden getting out, however sloppy he did it, is there was no reason to stay. It wasn't working.
Right. 20 years, and the Taliban is still the Taliban, and still there.
Both men were trained to kill overseas, but unskilled at coping at home, leaving a trail of broken marriages and, for Jabbar, money woes. And both, in their so-called manifestos of murder, sublimated their rage and feelings of misogyny to adopt a veneer of political rationalization. As a leading chronicler of American war abuses, the journalist Nick Tariffs reported, U.S. military service is now the #1 predictor for mass casualty violence here at home. A factor that's increased dramatically since around 2011, when America marked its 10th anniversary in Afghanistan. Tariffs cites University of Maryland research that 1/4 of all known plotted U.S. mass casualty events from 1990 through 2023 were tied to veterans or active troops, far greater than their share of the population. And so the fellow who blew himself up in the car jumps off the page. His ex-girlfriend, Alicia Arlett, told the Denver Gazette that the 19-year soldier was a changed man after suffering a traumatic brain injury during a Middle Eastern tour in 2019, but refused to get treatment for apparent depression and post-traumatic stress disorder, citing the macho nature of his work with special forces.
I see. The macho nature, eh? All right.
Leibelsberger's final letters, discovered after the bombing, attacked America's leaders as weak and only serving to enrich themselves. In the aftermath of 2021's chaotic end to the U.S. role in Afghanistan, but also spoke his own anguish and even guilt. I need to cleanse my mind of the brothers I've lost and relieve myself of the burden of the lives I took. So, needless to say, you didn't hear about that on Fox News amid the tape loop of open border lies. You can argue about how the 2021 pullout from Kabul was handled or screwed up, but there's no appetite for a serious debate on how 20 years of often pointless war affects the men and women dispatched there. So I think that's an important thing to get out there. And the other thing that tied them together, the other bond, a history of tortured relations with the women in their lives. As a civilian, for example, the New Orleans fellow managed to get divorced 3 times in 2012, 2016, and 2020, despite a 6-figure salary. As a corporate accountant, he struggled both with paying child support for his 3 kids and with his outside business ventures. A lifelong Muslim, Jabbar, according to reports, seemed to embrace the more radical and fundamentalist worldview of ISIS as his private life unraveled in Houston.
Yeah, another
and that's why I got Houston confused. He's from Houston, went to New Orleans. It's the other fellow who blew up the car in Las Vegas.
Right. Yeah, there was a lot of misinformation about the arc of this guy's life, too. So good point made there. Lifelong Muslim. I think originally the story was someone was trying to seed the story that this had been some sort of conversion, midlife conversion, and therefore somehow more radical, but apparently not.
Indeed, Bunch writes, it feels like people are truly determined to find the political links to mass murder, but it's hiding in plain sight. It's misogyny and the role that a long overdue assault on the contradictions and unfairness of modern patriarchy is now playing in the current backlash of right-wing populist and testosterone-laced political movements, and not just in America. And he cites, for example, this is a post by the London Review of Books at the Bad Place. One of the most striking post-election statistics was the rise in support for Trump among the young. Many of us were shocked, though we shouldn't have been. Trump's content was being pumped at young men at a greater rate than even Andrew Tate.
Sure, true.
So this is a whole thing about angry young men for Trump.
Yeah.
Male rage over the possible implosion of their ancient hierarchy has become a dangerous double-edged sword. The dull edge is the dude bro podcast politics, and the sharp edge is what lashed out on Bourbon Street. So we got to pay attention to all of that.
Okay.
So no, it's okay Kamala Harris didn't go on Joe Rogan. It really is.
Yeah, right. You have to speak to them there, although no, you don't. And not that they were earlier.
And especially if they demand you change your schedule for them.
Well, that was crazy. That was bananas, and that was clearly designed to keep her off the show as well, which was
or make her so-called bend the knee, at least in the hierarchy of power sense.
Yeah, I mean, just totally outside of any sort of reasonable condition. I guess he just didn't want it to happen. And interesting because he kept claiming at the beginning, well, even before he interviewed Trump, I don't want to get involved in the politics. And clearly you're not going to be making demands like this on anybody, right? Oh, all right. You are? Well, you're a huge hypocrite, but what are we going to do? All right.
So Democrats in the working class after the break, there's a lot to be said about that, and that ties in with these guys, which is why I wanted to start with them.
Okay. Sure, why not? All right, well, let's take a break at Don't Riot, come right back, and I'm going to test out a couple of weird features that are still popping up, get them out of the way once we're off the air.
Hi, I'm Scott Anderson, the guy that writes the daily summary for this show, Kagro in the Morning. Thank you to everyone that supports this show. Many of you send donations through PayPal, Patreon, Square Cash, Radio Public, and so on. Some of you write your own essays and send them in, or read articles with your own commentary. We appreciate it. Now, some of you are listening to this and thinking, I'd like to help, but isn't there something I could do that wouldn't require money or effort? Why, yes, there is. You can just like us. On Daily Kos, they call it the recommend button. YouTube has a thumbs up. There are hearts and likes and love buttons. Tap our love button. Tap our love button every day. Share our shows and summaries on Facebook and Twitter, YouTube and iTunes, Stitcher and Amazon. Most of these places allow you to write a review, so a sentence or two would be great. Recommend us to social media, or tell your friends to listen to the show. You aren't just helping us, you're helping them find their new favorite thing to listen to. You could change the world. So thank you in advance from me and everybody else in the world.
All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. I wish I could say the same to Skype messaging services or the chat, which, I don't know, someone must have updated something and made it better. And I would guess that artificial intelligence is what was added here, and I need to ask, there probably is a Skype AI agent that I need to subscribe to and ask them to please send me the messages that my friends have sent, and that's the enhanced intelligence of it. I'm noticing a lot of things that I have a couple of apps that I guess to force you to use their AI thing, say, we're no longer doing the thing that you subscribed to or downloaded our app to do, but we can if you'll just press this button to let our AI reanalyze what you've asked for. And at that point, it performs the actual function that I downloaded the app for, but by AI. I don't even know what that means, except that a lake dries up somewhere, but I get the information I was looking for. Very odd, and I think we're doomed. But thank you. And so we've been having a problem with Skype, and for some reason all of the links to everything so I can follow along that Greg's covering, they decide not to publish them. Sometimes until a couple hours after the show. But they're coming through again now. I appreciate it.
Yeah, again, just to reiterate, I'm a blogger. We send links. The reason we do so is I don't want to pretend that all these interesting intellectual thoughts are my own alone, actually stolen from everybody else, and I want to give you the links and give them credit.
Yeah.
And so that's why we send all these links. It's not to confuse people or, make it difficult to find. Why do you send a raft of stories? Because I want to send links to everything I'm saying here.
Yeah, right. I like to be able to say, maybe you hear the story and you say, that doesn't sound right, or I know something about that. Where did you see that? I want to show you.
Maybe you misinterpreted it. Maybe I did.
It's not that I don't want to make things up. I do. I love making things up.
But I'll tell you when I do.
Right. And, this is the reason I said this about this story, because that guy said that. Maybe I got it wrong. But, all right, well, I won't get into it any further.
Well, it's just a philosophical approach to life
show.
That requires me, it impels me to send links to David, and so it's nice when he can actually see them.
Yeah, I prefer that, Skype, if you're listening. And I know you're listening. Now everybody's listening, it turns out.
Russia, if you're listening, please restore those links. Yeah. So
maybe you
the
can find
story I wanted to do with a set of stories sort of plays off the idea that there's this working class angst, rage, whatever.
Right, price of eggs.
And we see it. The media sees it but won't report on it. Question on the table is, does the Democratic Party see it? And this is centered around one article and two responses to the article. That is to say, 3 articles.
Okay.
And the first one is by Jonathan Weissman, and it's an interesting one. And even his critics say it's an interesting piece.
Okay.
How the Democrats lost the working class.
The
theory seemed sound. Stabilize financial markets, support the poor, promote a more secure, integrated world.
All right.
Problem is blue-collar workers were left behind. So this has to do, interestingly enough, to me, is it's really a critique of neoliberalism.
The
Republicans have succeeded in diverting any attention to the role they played in neoliberalism to say it's all a Democratic scheme. Blame them, not us. And that worked.
Oh, no.
As annoying as it is.
Yeah.
In my view. So we'll get to that. But Democrats had just absorbed a crushing defeat in the 1994 election when President Bill Clinton's very liberal Labor Secretary Robert Reich ventured into hostile territory to issue a prophetic warning. I don't know. This was on C-SPAN. I don't know how.
Well, you can be prophetic, just not
struggling workers are becoming an anxious class, he told the Democratic leadership.
Ooh, anxiety.
2 weeks after Republicans led by Newt Gingrich had gained 54 seats in the House and 8 in the Senate.
Yes.
Just to put in perspective, we didn't do that bad this time.
Right.
Society was separating into 2 tiers, Mr. Reich said, with a few winners and a larger group of Americans left behind whose anger and whose disillusionment is easily manipulated. Today, he said, meaning a long time ago, the targets of that rage are immigrants and welfare mothers and government officials and gays and an ill-defined counterculture. But as the middle class continues to erode, who will be the targets tomorrow? Immigrants and Democrats.
Yes.
Why do I say Democrats? Because of that manifesto by the guy who blew himself up in Las Vegas.
Right.
His message went largely unheeded for 30 years as one president after another, Republican and Democratic, led administrations into a post-Cold War global future that enriched the nation as a whole, some on the coast to staggering levels, but left many pockets of the American heartland deindustrialized, dislocated, and even depopulated. Note, he says, Republicans and Democrats. And one of the annoying things to me is Democrats never ran against Republicans who did this. But Republicans were happy to run against Democrats. In places like Ohio, which has really been hard hit by this kind of thing, Republicans just keep winning because, they were in charge.
Yeah. Or despite the fact that they were in charge. Yeah, and just insist that, for some reason, despite our being in charge, Democrats were the ones who did this. I don't know why we let them do that. But they did.
As a half-century-old world order organized around American-Soviet contention gave way to a more freely competitive landscape of shifting alliances, presidents from both parties sought to secure U.S. And you can't fault Weissman for not pointing out it's both sides. sought to secure U.S. leadership under new rules. Democratic presidents tried with limited success to expand safety nets at home, especially health care and income support for the poor. In the end, however, the bets on foreign policy, like opening China to capitalism, halting Iran's nuclear program, tightening economic bonds with allies, took precedence in a new fealty to mega donors, fiscal policies that bolstered financial markets but shuttered many factories. And herein is the core of the critique here, that you'll hear not just from him, but from a whole bunch of different people. It's even playing out in the race to see who's going to be the new Democratic National Committee chair.
Okay.
And Martin from Minnesota or Ben Wickler from Wisconsin. Because the Bernie people are saying Wickler's too corporate and too beholden to the donors. That's at the core of Jordan Weissman's story here, and so that's why I want to focus on it, because it has lots of different ramifications. The unintended consequences often came at the expense of American workers and Mr. Rice's anxious class. Neither the impoverished nor the high flyers, but the ones in the middle, felt unheard until the rise of an unlikely new kind of Republican, Donald J. Trump. The Democratic Party's estrangement from working-class voters first became clear with Hillary Clinton, powered by broad shifts in the preferences of white voters without college degrees, and it became even more unmistakable with his emphatic defeat of Vice President Kamala Harris in November. Now, the fact that those were both women, does that have anything to do with it? Go back to what Will Bunch was writing about. That result was a reckoning for a party that thought it had fixed its problems with blue-collar workers by heavily reinvesting in domestic manufacturing, but instead discovered even more erosion, this time among black and Latino workers.
Yes.
So is it all about race? Well, how come black and Latino workers deserted them? Is it about misogyny? Well, that cuts across all demographics. Many Democrats have blamed recent social issues like transgender rights or the woke language, but the economic seeds of Mr. Trump's victories were sown long ago. One of the things that's been frustrating about the narrative, said Michael Podhorzer, the former political director of the AFL-CIO, is that the Democrats are losing the working class is that people are noticing it half a century after it already happened.
Yeah, right. Okay.
The resentment and movement away from Democrats began long before they were for non-gendered bathrooms. It was because their lives are becoming more precarious. The kids were leaving town. The pensions they expected were evaporating, and that took a toll. Fix the pensions. Okay, Biden did. Did it make a difference? No.
Right. Surprisingly not.
Surprisingly not. So, yeah, union leaders have their own views on what's important, and those pensions to them are important because they could sell to their constituents that they saved the pensions. But that's not going to change how people vote. How do I know? Because I just saw it.
Yeah.
To be sure, blue-collar voters have long been fickle. Nixon's silent majority delivered him a landslide in 1972, propelled not by a Republican economic platform, by a backlash to civil rights legislation, anti-Vietnam War protests. Since I'm of that generation, one of the reasons I'm not so keen on like super mega protests is like it doesn't get you what you think it gets you. The so-called Reagan Democrats, stung by inflation economic malaise, helped give the White House back to the GOP 8 years later. It remained in Republican hands for 12 years, 12 long years. William Galston, domestic policy advisor to Mr. Clinton and an architect of the Democrats' shift to the center, said that after the election debacles of 80, 84, and 88, the party's repositioning on social and economic issues was not a choice but an imperative. But once Mr. Clinton took office, choices were made. The Clinton vision was to be pro-growth, progressive, by combining major expansions in public investment and major advances in the safety net. Combine that with more private investment, said Gene Sperling. As the first post-Cold War president, Clinton also tried to have a focus on strengthening global relations through trade agreements. Now, before pointing out that NAFTA was negotiated under George H.W. Bush, but it fell to Clinton to get it through Congress, and his rationale was a trade agreement would enhance Mexico's stability and economic growth, and that would help in fighting the drug war.
Right.
And a wider social safety net would cushion the blow of employment losses. But, again, without going into the article more, a social safety net is not a substitute for having a job.
True.
You have to have a job. If you don't have a job and you're getting welfare, you're not going to feel the same.
True.
So it's not like a one-to-one trade-off there. Then the healthcare push collapsed in 1994, and over the objections of more liberal voices in the administration, Mr. Clinton chose pull the plug on free trade on internationalism versus push ahead without the safety net. Well, he pushed ahead without the safety net. Even then, there was concern that China's accession into the family trading nations could flood the U.S. with cheap imports and bankrupt American manufacturers. You might think I was nuts, Mr. Clinton allowed last month as he discussed international trade at the New York Times Deal Book Summit, but Jiang Zemin was president of China, and he was a good one. And he's not president anymore.
Well, okay. I mean,
so
does happen.
The tendency to roll the dice on grand international bets with working class voters as the chips would become a theme, and too often the bets didn't pay off. China became more autocratic. We know what happened in the Middle East. A whole bunch of stuff happened. And by January 2008, the China shock had cost U.S. manufacturers nearly 4 million jobs. And as the financial crisis got better in 2010, manufacturing employment had bottomed out below 11.5 million. I would be the first to say the leadership of both political parties were in the grip of a theory, a story that turned out to be wrong, said Bill Galston, and damagingly so. So again, that's neoliberalism. That's not necessarily Democrats, but it fell to Clinton to be the one to push that. And that's one of the reasons, and I would say actually more important than whatever his reevaluation of Monica and his relationship was in 2024 terms, the fact that Clinton was pushing sending jobs overseas, as it's somehow shorthandedly said, that was just a bad bet. And American workers remember that, don't like it, and would not vote for that and won't vote for it now. And so that economic anxiety, I think, is quite real. And when we make fun of it and say, well, it's economic anxiety, when you really mean racism and misogyny, actually it is economic anxiety.
Well, in some cases, yes, I guess so.
But it's also the other things.
Yeah, I mean, it is.
I mean, it's not like either or.
No.
Like to say, well, it's not economic. Yeah, but it is.
Working. There's no reason to believe that the
inflation
working
is
class.
Under control. The rent's too damn high. Okay,
yeah.
That's the issue there. Housing costs way too much. So do eggs, even if it's bird flu.
Yes. True, and there's nothing that says that, although they consider themselves to be simple folks and salt of the earth, they're as complex as anybody else. I don't understand why we wouldn't think so, but that's a complexity in its own right. People don't think that people have complex thoughts. They do. Sometimes they're contradictory. Those we notice. I don't understand. You said you wanted something, or you wanted more access to healthcare, and then you got it, and you still don't care. Yeah, that's right. They don't. There might be other things at work.
Right. So, when shopping at Trader Joe's for some things, we don't buy everything at Trader Joe's. It's too expensive, but some things we like there because we like to buy organic sometimes, for health.
How nice.
And went the other day, and there were no regular eggs. They were sold out.
Oh.
And the only eggs that were left, and they were plentiful, were organic eggs.
Okay.
Organically grown. What does that mean? Less like they have bird flu. They're not factory farms.
Okay, that's good. And that was all they had left. So actually,
but they're more expensive. And so guess what? Everybody at Trader Joe's was complaining about the price of eggs.
Though they had gone to Trader Joe's.
I wanted to go around the store saying, remember this conversation, remember this day, remember who's about to be president. But
I'm not going to do that.
But, the point is that people notice these things, and it's what they care about.
I guess so. Not complaining about the price of birria tacos? Frozen?
No, I don't know. I wasn't in that
goat
aisle.
Cheese? Or
I was in the egg aisle.
Okay. Well, I mean, the good news is the wine costs less
these
than
days
the
because
eggs.
of bird flu. It's not surprising to hear that conversation. That's the aisle that this conversation was taking place. I can't believe how expensive these eggs are. Well,
that is
organic
unusual.
Eggs. They're always more expensive.
Right.
You think this is expensive? Try Whole Foods.
Right. True.
But I don't want I want to go to like an ordinary average ShopRite or Price Chopper or whatever you call your local grocery.
And
And maybe you can't reach it. Maybe you can. But even there, you'll find that the regular eggs are sold out and the organic eggs are there, and they're more expensive.
But you'll be so healthy or something. I don't know. All right. Well, that's it's certainly on people's minds, even if they're not buying eggs. Or one of the big topics somehow over the weekend got to be, I guess, I don't even know how the conversation started. I unfortunately saw it in the middle and I didn't get involved, but people were talking about the relative price of shopping for groceries and cooking at home versus ordering food via delivery services. And that some cohort of the younger generations was insisting, no, it's actually cheaper to eat by having burritos delivered by DoorDash than to cook at home. And golly, that just feels like it's not really true. But I guess we were talking about two separate things. One was the cost of learning, home economics, as they used to call it, and shopping,
which the guys weren't allowed to do.
Right.
My era.
True. And versus
take shop.
Versus, well, if a burrito is $7. But you want to make a burrito at home and you go into the store and you buy tortillas and meat and salsa and sour cream and cheese and guacamole, you'll end up spending more than that $7. But, the home economics part is, well, then you make more burritos later or something else with the rest of those ingredients.
Right.
What?
You're not talking about one burrito.
Yeah.
And neither are the chains, and that's how come it costs what it costs.
Right.
So Weissman points out, overall, China's integration into world markets did increase the number of jobs in the U.S.
Yes.
But also selling services like insurance and Hollywood movies to the Chinese made for jobs in those sectors. And peddling Chinese-made goods at stores like Walmart sharply lowered the cost of living for Americans.
Yes.
But what was less appreciated beforehand was the psychological damage that would be done by factory closures, large and small, in communities where prestige, stability, and identity centered on the plants, especially in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, and Wisconsin. Democratic policies focused on people as consumers instead of as workers, counting on those people whose jobs were eliminated to find their way to jobs newly created. A flawed assumption, given that the new service jobs required out-of-reach skills or were located in the coasts, not in the upper Midwest. Too often, said Jared Bernstein, the chairman of President Biden's Council of Economic Advisors, there was a disregard for the importance of work and the dignity of work. 40 people might have lost their job in a factory. 100,000 people in the community had lower prices, and the calculus seemed obvious, and that calculus was wrong.
Yeah, I can see that, and people just not really. I don't. Who would view things macroeconomically, right? How many times have you said on the show? I understand the trends. I don't have a job.
Right.
I see that there are jobs out there, and some other people may even be getting them, but it's not me.
Blue collar workers turned on the trickle down economics of the Reagan years and didn't elect HW for a second term. And they spurned the GOP again in 2012 when it turned to Mitt Romney, who was a wealthy businessman plucked from plutocratic central casting. But under Mr. Obama, nobody on Wall Street or in the banking sector faced prosecution for the global financial crisis. And after Mr. Obama called bankers fat cats on 60 Minutes, Democratic donors on Wall Street howled. The masters of the universe turned out to be more sensitive than we thought, said David Axelrod. So Obama tempered his language, which was politically a mistake.
Okay.
I added the politically a mistake.
Yeah, well.
People wanted folks to pay a price for that. And this is where the Democrats wind up being too beholden to the donors. And all of it, says Douglas Holtz-Eakin, a veteran Republican economic advisor, and all of it, the elites got away unscathed. The ordinary man took it on the chin, and that kind of resentment with this Mr. Trump, with his relentless economic appeals and his open disregard for America's global leadership, broke the Democratic formula by winning over not only a large majority of the white working class, but a strong percentage of workers of color as well. Now, there's plenty of blame to go around. Labor leaders often point to the Democratic Party's movement away from unions. Most workers are not members, and it was believed unions were unpopular. But when you talk to unions, said that AFL-CIO guy, You're talking to an institution that can hold you accountable to the promises you're making, can ask you for specific things. When you're talking around them, you're basically doing commercial marketing. But that sets you up for the moment when a Donald Trump comes along and you have a candidate who has a better marketing strategy than you do.
I guess.
Right? So workers and the AFL and others didn't want to adjust NAFTA. They wanted to kill NAFTA. Mm-hmm. And there were other missed opportunities. Mr. Furman said the Obama administration's timid response to the financial crisis prolonged the slow, frustrating recovery, intensifying the anger that Trump tapped into in 2016. But then again, Republicans controlled Congress at that point, so you couldn't really do much. Do I wish Clinton had spent the surplus on great things instead of handing it to George W. Bush? Yes. Do I think he could have spent it on all those great things in a divided government? No. So then Biden tried to recalibrate. Inflation, and the pandemic really played an enormous role in screwing all of that up. And that's Weissman's idea of what happened.
Okay.
And it's interesting. And I think he's got a lot of interesting points. Now, Seth Maskett, political scientist, says, listen, Jonathan Weissman's substantial New York Times piece, How Democrats Lost the Working Class, is important. I commend it. But there are a few key points about U.S. politics one should recognize before digging into this article.
Oh, no, before.
I'm doing it after, but, I wanted to give you the article first. Number one, a substantial chunk, 90%, let's say, of the story about the working class leaving the Democratic Party is a story about race. To simplify, it's about working class whites starting in the 70s, Latinos more recently, being mobilized against the Democratic Party due to resentment towards blacks. That's number one. He left that out of the story. Number two, we've never had a consensus of what working class is.
That's true.
Could mean people without a college education. Could mean lower income people. Could be people in specific types of jobs like manufacturing or service or something else. Mm-hmm. It's also a populist cultural designation, one that Trump has exploited well, signifying the tastes of regular people. Just who has left the Democratic Party and when is highly contingent on one's conception of working class.
Yes.
Number three, governing majorities do not exist to be popular. The opposite is true. The main job parties have, other than trying to win elections, is to steer the government to fulfill various policy commitments they view as important, but may invite electoral pushback. Democrats pushed health care reform in Obama's first term, knowing full well it wasn't very popular, but it would save a lot of lives. Republicans know that tax cuts geared toward upper incomes or votes against raising the minimum wage aren't popular. They view these stances as important to their coalition and beneficial to the country, even if it hurts them in elections. Mm-hmm. And so you can go into the details, but, those are some major big things that you have to, keep an eye on. So if this is about whites and their racial resentments, how does this account for Latinos shifting rightward in recent elections? As John Sides wrote recently, it's important to note just which Latinos are moving right. Generally, it's the ones with the strongest racial animus toward blacks. Relatedly, here's what Trump pollster Patrick Ruffini had to say after the election.
Oh, no.
I did a poll in Texas of Hispanics in Texas where I asked them, what's the number one problem you see today with the Democratic Party? The answer they gave wasn't it was too woke. It wasn't that it was socialism. The answer was interesting. It's something you don't see come up with virtually any other group you talk to. And that is they perceive the Democratic Party as being the party of welfare benefits or people who don't work. That's the Reagan welfare queen argument all over again. In other words, the biggest movement toward the Republican Party, Maskett writes, is by former Democratic voters who think of blacks as freeloaders.
Yikes.
And that was completely left out of Weissman's piece.
Yeah. Okay. That is pretty amazing. And that's what leads people to say, what is this economic anxiety, but really a cover for their racism? Well, in some ways it is. That's true. I understand there's an economic component to it and that you're anxious about it, but
right. The big international lesson, he writes, of 2024, the majority parties in every democracy that held an election lost seats, we've gone over this on this show, remains a key insight. Oh, I'm happy that we picked it out
I'm glad.
And covered it.
It's ours. We did it.
And there's no reason the U.S. should have been exempt, but also parties pursue their policy goals because they believe the goals will be better for the country in the long run. Sometimes the goals are unpopular. Obamacare is a great example. I was pushing it hard, even though I knew it was unpopular at the time, because it was the right thing to do. And I thought eventually, once you start using it, it will be popular. And that's exactly how it turned out.
And 100% right. It was very clear to me that was what was being said. That you were saying.
You can do that. You can push an unpopular policy.
People will realize.
And assume that eventually it'll be popular, but you have to be right about that.
Oh.
They weren't right about NAFTA.
Damn it. Yeah. True, and it was right in a very weird way, of course, even about Obamacare. Even to this day, it's sometimes difficult to get people to admit that that's the case, and you have to trick them in a way. Oh, do you like this policy? Yeah, I do. Did you know it was part of Obamacare? No, now I hate it. There's still people that do that.
Yeah, well, that's the thing, and so he goes on to say most voters don't notice. And economic improvement rarely happens quickly enough to change voters' impressions.
True also.
So, you also have this whole contingent of people that don't pay attention to anything. So, don't worry about it.
Yeah. And then, right. And
but if you don't get their
magical
vote, you should have worried about it. That's what this is.
Yeah. There's also the magical thinking of it doesn't, but I'm upset I lost my job. Oh, we can help you with that. No, I want that job back. Well, that we can't do, but we can help you get another one. I don't want help. I want that.
So he points out a thing that happened. We all remember. We covered it on the show.
Okay.
In September of 2023, as UAW members went on strike, Biden joined the picket line. Trump gave a non-union auto parts manufacturer rally.
Yes.
Okay. And Maskett said, I would say Biden's approach was the more substantive one, but regardless, they're both trying to woo a working class that was up for grabs. And I'm not saying Trump's approach worked better, but it's clear it didn't do worse.
Yeah, but it should have.
It should have, but it didn't.
Yeah.
And the fact that it didn't is the key thing there.
I guess so. Something's the damn key. Oh, it's killing me. I don't know.
It's complicated, but some of it really is economic anxiety that dates back 30 years. And some of it is complete policy blindness and marketing blindness to the idea that this would hurt people and they don't like it. No, you have to like it because it's good for us. That is a bad approach.
Overall, it balances out. Well, I don't feel that way. All right. Thanks very much, Greg. All right. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Gosh, there's so much to do. And so little time. And so many things. There was lots of discussion over the weekend of the peripheral discussion of Weissman's piece, rebuttals to it, companion pieces. There are a number of them. And I don't really know how to address it all. But let's see, a couple of things to cover besides it's being January 6th. And I guess the thing to do is to focus on the fact that it's January 6th and at least focus on congressional type news, looks back at January 6th. But I did have a very interesting and very long read that will eat up the rest of the show from Michael Podhorzer, who was quoted in the Weissman piece, who has a very interesting, although again weedy and but that's what makes it interesting to all of us. Approach to the whole to a similar question: how Trump won the anesthetized anti-MAGA majority is his view of how the election came out. It's very interesting and deserves a lot of time, but maybe on a non-January 6th day. But, by the way, in closing one in scare quotes there, that is a good reminder of what appears to have actually happened in the election, and basically reminding everybody there's no mandate, certainly, but that's not going to change Donald Trump or Republicans' insistence on pretending that there is one. 2, it wasn't a huge win. It was historically very narrow. 3, it wasn't necessarily a huge failure by Democrats or the Kamala Harris campaign, although I guess ultimately it does come down to that, in that in the end, yes, she did in many places underperform Biden's performance, but then again, we're reminded that every place in the battleground states, which, you good reason to believe that those are the key places to fight this election. And when she did do that, she improved her performance vis-a-vis And I know Brian Schatz says, I'm not supposed to say things like vis-a-vis, but I think you guys know what I mean. But improving her performance versus, let's say, that's a word everybody seems to understand, versus performance drop-offs anyway, elsewhere in states that weren't battlegrounds. Basically, I guess if we long story short this thing, and we really shouldn't, but if you're interested in finding out what's in there and I don't know, reading it ahead of time and cheating so that you don't let me discuss it with you later, you deprive me of the opportunity to discuss it with you. But I won't find out until it's too late, and I will take my time reading through this thing. But the long story short on it is very interesting dynamic that in the battleground states where it was going to be really close and where they concentrated their fire, not only did they underperform by less, but they motivated people to come out by being there and saying what's at stake. In, say, reliably blue states, where less campaigning was done and less of the, less concentration of fire there for good reason. I mean, think about it, right? Strategically, it makes a certain amount of sense. But the weird but understandable reaction to that, particularly by among voters who are Democratic-leaning or liberal-leaning, left-leaning, depending on how you want to define them, but and ordinarily, therefore, and understand the election as a choice between disastrous Republican policy and disastrous candidacy of Donald Trump, and perhaps for them the not particularly exciting Joe Biden and or Kamala Harris alternative. At some point, it does sink in that in New York, in California, in certain other states, where we've become so attuned to the Electoral College, meaning that your vote means less, people don't get off the couch and come to vote. And it doesn't affect the ultimate outcome because that state went, quote unquote, went blue anyway, and its electoral votes go to Kamala Harris. But it's important, especially as, Donald Trump now crows about having this mandate to destroy everything or do whatever the hell he wants, essentially. And he points to his popular vote victory, which is one, historically narrow, and two, not particularly reflective of where the eligible electorate is. But if you don't come and vote, that's what ends up happening. It looks like he won the popular vote. Had people, and it could still have come out the other way electorally, but I don't know. I mean, maybe not to Donald Trump because he boasts about everything, but to the rest of us, it would still look a little bit different had he lost the popular vote overwhelmingly, but won the Electoral College vote. Anyway, there's a good point in there about Democrats in blue states or Democratic leaning or inclined voters just simply not showing up because it doesn't appear to make a difference for them. But rhetorically, I suppose it does. All right. But like I said, it's other things we kind of have to pay some attention to on January 6th, and there are an awful lot of angles to take on it. And I put a couple of them aside, including, let's see. Here's one. I don't know. This one I think kind of needs to be shared and my own thinking about it. But on Kash Patel, returning to Kash Patel as a subject, and the link here being from Thomas Jocelyn and Norm Eisen's piece in The Bulwark, where Greg loves to lead us all the time. Kash Patel believes, maybe, I mean, it says so in the headline, he believes it, that the FBI, which of course he's nominated or will be nominated by Donald Trump to lead as FBI director, Patel believes the FBI planned January 6th. Now, there's a lot of dispute already about, he doesn't believe it. He just knows to say it, and he wants to exploit the rubes. But I don't know what the difference is if you're out there saying it publicly. And golly, that seems awfully dangerous. Seems to me like once you read through it, you begin to realize, reiterate, I guess. The piece reiterates the dangers, which we all know, of putting somebody like him in charge. His embrace of this wild conspiracy theory, the idea that the FBI somehow planned January 6th, should disqualify him from leading the Bureau That's the subheader. Guess what? Of course, Republicans in Congress, in the Senate in particular, who have the vote on this, aren't willing to buy it publicly. Though I do suspect, since we're questioning whether or not Kash Patel actually believes this about the FBI, I question whether or not Republican senators actually believe whether he believes it or not, or believe whether or not it would be a good idea to keep him, or that it might be okay to let him lead the FBI. I believe that they believe it isn't, but they're going to do it anyway for various reasons. So let's catch up on what their thinking is here, what their theory. What was the FBI doing planning January 6th for a year? That's a quote from this particular idiot now slated to lead the place, Kash Patel. He is, of course, President-elect Donald Trump's nominee to serve as FBI director, and he asked that question during a November 25th, 2022 episode of his Kash's Corner podcast for the Epic Times, like a known Looney Tunes fake newspaper with connections to weirdo Chinese radicals, including the wackadoodles that let people like Steve Bannon live on their yachts. Like, what are we doing in this country? I don't know. But anyway, and by the way, I think we mentioned this before, Kash's Corner previously reported in some outlet or another that we noted on the show as, well, it's not really him. It's just a show he co-hosts. It's called Kash's Corner, but somehow previous iterations of this have let him off the hook entirely. Anyway, not this one. This one is quoting him. And it was no slip of the tongue to have said that, they report, as the title of that episode suggested, not just the title of the show, Kash's Corner, but the title of the episode was, in fact, what did the FBI know before January 6th? Patel spent considerable time trying to cast the FBI as a villain responsible for January 6th. Ironically, you'll find that there are some others who say, well, they bear some responsibility for it because I, too, asked what did the FBI know before January 6th. But what I'm saying from this other perspective is there were plenty of signs online that something very, very serious was being planned by someone else, by the actual perpetrators, and should have been recognizable, and they should have been ready to put a stop to it much earlier. And they weren't because, I don't know what, both some combination of being asleep at the wheel, not really believing anybody would ever try something so ridiculous, and being pushed away from any idea of doing something serious about it by the Trump appointees who were still in charge of the organizations that were supposed to be responding to this. So you see, we're really through the looking glass here, right? Realize what we're saying here is that Kash Patel, a Trump world figure, if there ever was one, is insisting that he should be able to take over the FBI to prove to everybody that the FBI was the ones who perpetrated January 6th, not the awesome patriots who were just there to peacefully share the love that day as they're rewriting their history. And the FBI is the evil, terrible people who were really behind all of this. As if people forget, I know he was staging a coup to try to reverse the results of the election. But remember how much effort Greg put into telling us all that, well, it's not a coup, it's an autogolpe, right? You're borrowing from, instead of borrowing from the French, calling it a coup, we'll borrow from the Spanish language and call it autogolpe. And showing, distinguishing between the two. It seemed like a technicality at the time, but it was Donald Trump trying to pull this stunt in order to accrue more power to himself, but to remain in office. In other words, not to offend Brian Schatz here by centering the weird language, but what was happening here was Donald Trump was the president at the time that this thing happened. And yet here he is saying, well, it's Nancy Pelosi's fault for not calling out the National Guard or providing for the protection of the Capitol. And it's like, you were the commander in chief on January 6th, 2021, Trump, and you were commanding the opposing forces. And to the extent that you still had control of American forces, you were telling them to stand down and prohibiting them from protecting the Capitol. That was your job. Well, no, Nancy Pelosi should. Look, the defense of the country falls to who? The commander-in-chief or the Speaker of the House? Come on. And, of course, the idea that Kash Patel says, well, the FBI was the one who did this. Well, who was in charge of the FBI? Donald Trump and his guy, Christopher Wray. And they're just like, right now, they're currently right in front of everybody, just merrily skipping along, insisting that Christopher Wray is the big traitor here. It's like, it's your guy. It's your guy. What are you talking? You have to be able to see that this doesn't hang together and make any sense. They just don't care. That's why we're not sure whether Kash Patel believes anything. It's just he's doing this thing. Anyway, back to their organized thoughts here. Patel has spent on his stupid podcast considerable time trying to cast the FBI as a villain responsible for January 6th. Patel noted that FBI Director Christopher Wray, the Trump guy, had, quote, testified that the FBI never investigated or helped the January 6th protesters commit crimes. And that's because they didn't. But citing a report that the FBI had confidential human sources in the crowd, which is a totally different thing, Patel asserted, okay, well, that was in planning for at least a year. Okay, well, why do you say that? This is where you're supposed to provide links to reputable sources about your declaration that it was in planning for at least a year. But he doesn't bother because there aren't any. Our review at the Bulwark of Patel's public appearances over the past 4 years reveals that he has repeatedly insinuated or argued that the FBI used its confidential human sources or employees to instigate the January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol and entrap Trump's supporters. Remember, they were there for a day of love, right, in the new revisionary thinking. But this slightly different. Patel has been saying the whole time that, we have, you see what he's doing is he's just conflating intentionally what he's got with what he wishes it showed. Were there human sources there, human intelligence sources who were informants for the FBI present on January 6th? Sure. Well, lots of people were present on the Capitol grounds on January 6th, including people who were the victims of January 6th. And I don't mean Ashley Babbitt, but there were people there who were the focus of the attack. There are people who stood in the way of the attack. There are people who had nothing to do with the attack. There was lots of people there. But for you to say that there were informants there who were there to try to let law enforcement and I guess eventually at some level the armed forces, National Guard and or others who might respond to this, what's going on? Did they cultivate informants in the crowd? Sure, because there are a bunch of crazies here to attack the Capitol. Do you want to know what's happening on the ground among these people? Yes, you do. But what Patel is saying is the fact that you had informants equals the informants were not there just to inform on what was going on, but rather to instigate what was going on and entrap people into the look. I find it very hard to believe that entrapment can. Does entrapment really explain smearing feces on the walls of the Capitol? You'd really think that there were FBI informants in there and saying, all right, we've beaten the crap out of cops. We've hit them over the head with fire extinguishers. We've smashed the windows and doors in, kicked our way into the Capitol, and we're feet away from the Senate floor. Why don't we all stop, take a crap, and smear it on the walls? Really? Really? That was, you think, what was going on? And nothing explains all the rest of it. Of course, Patel would say, no, you instigated them into doing all of those things, which is why people packed up vans full of guns, pipe bombs, portable gallows, apparently, signs, flags, all of this gear that they brought with them, and drove all the way to Washington, D.C., even though they were working, the hardworking entrepreneurial people who, were white-collar workers. And there's somebody out there arguing that the vast majority of the protesters were white-collar workers, and so therefore you ought not to blame them for anything. I don't know how that conclusion comes around. All right. But the idea that this was all entrapment is insane. But I guess the upshot of all of this is if you put someone like Kash Patel in there from Team Forgery in charge of the FBI, very shortly, I suppose, if you're the kind of person waiting for this, you will find the so-called evidence that you were right all along. Kash Patel will just forge and plant that evidence. A vote to confirm Kash Patel as director of the FBI in the United States Senate is a vote in favor of evidence planting, a massive evidence planting scheme yet to be revealed, I'm sure. But I guess we'll find out in real time. Later on, all of a sudden, Kash Patel will say, I have been digging in the files, and guess what I found, which was hidden from view while I wasn't the director of the FBI? Why, it's documentation that says that everything I said was right and everything they said was wrong. I can't believe it. And I'm not sure how America is going to respond to being told that the official law enforcement organization, the national police, essentially, the FBI, say they've investigated, and guess what? We found massive cover-up by our own organization. Somehow. They all kept the files. Nobody burned anything. Nobody secreted it away. They're supposed to be international super spies. But they left it here for us, and golly, if we didn't find it, and gosh, if it doesn't say exactly. This one here, this document even says Kash Patel is a super stud. It's amazing. I couldn't believe that the FBI kept records on that, but it happens to be true. And here's the record. I don't know. I'm not certain how people are going to take it. I'm pretty sure they're going to do it. Like I said, the reason I believe they'll do it, they forged electoral college votes. If you're going to forge that, you forge anything. And what's the price that they've paid for forging that stuff? Nothing. So will they forge evidence that Kash Patel was right? Sure. And for how long? I'm not sure. But for a couple of years, I would guess Kash Patel is going to be able to run around and say he was right. I'm worried that given that they were able to rewrite the history so far of January 6th and convince some people who weren't even there, and who would, I understand that people who were there and are being found guilty would have an interest in revising the history of that day. But people who had little or nothing to do with it are apparently pretty interested in accepting a revised history of it too. And if now the revised history comes with quote unquote evidence that they quote unquote found in the quote unquote FBI files that says, yeah, look, here's documentary evidence that we were right. We made it up. We put it there when we got there, but it is documentary and it is evidence. It's very poor evidence. It's forged evidence, but it's still evidence. I'm wondering who buys it. And I fear that almost anyone would. All right, so where we left off was, before jumping off for a long tirade, citing a report that the FBI had confidential human sources in the crowd, Patel asserted, okay, well, that was in planning for at least a year, which by itself is just nonsense. Why? Why a year? Why not 6 months? It points to nothing. But you'd like it to be a year, so you said it was a year. And there's no reason to believe that. And, of course, it has nothing to do with anything. Our review of Patel's public appearances over the past 4 years reveals that he has repeatedly insinuated or argued that the FBI used its confidential sources, right, to instigate the attack, to entrap Trump's supporters. Patel has claimed, as in the podcast episode previously named, that what he calls the, quote, FBI's confidential human source corruption cover-up network, it's not a thing, but that's what he made up, was somehow involved with January 6th. That is not only an insult to the memory of that day, it should be disqualifying for him to helm the Bureau. And yet, that's completely out the window, and we know it. During the September 30th, 2022 episode of Kash's Corner, for instance, Patel said, the question that has to be answered is, when did the FBI put those guys in and where? Of course, they didn't put any instigators in. They put informants in. They had a very different role than what he imagines. So he thinks the question that needs to be answered is, when did they put those guys in and where? Not, who are those guys and what did they do? He already has an assumption for that. And did those confidential human sources engage people who are not going to conduct criminal activity and convince them to do so? All right, if that's the question, then the answer is no. There's no evidence whatsoever that did, and there's plenty of evidence that they did not. But he says, forget all of that. Arrest the people who gave us and produced the evidence that this did not happen. And instead, let's then forge evidence that says it did happen, and then use that forged evidence to convict the people who previously investigated my question and found the answer to be no, and put them in jail for having investigated it wrongly, in my view. That's essentially what's going on here. So the question has to be answered in his view. When did the FBI start when did you start participating in this criminal cover-up? Right? It's like, when did you stop beating your wife thing? I mean, it's an exact parallel to it. When did you stop covering up that the FBI had instigated January 6th? I never stopped doing it because I never started doing it. Aha! Right. Patel claimed, of course, that this is the definition of entrapment. I mean, it is the definition of entrapment. It just didn't happen. But it's the definition of entrapment, which is illegal, and you can't charge someone who's been entrapped. And he wondered who was running this confidential human source network and reporting it to FBI Director Chris Wray, who was a Trump guy. Patel added he would venture a guess that once we see the documentation from January 6th, we haven't seen the real documentation yet. We've only seen that fake documentation that says that this didn't happen. Wait till you see what I forge up. And when you do, you will see the FBI's confidential human source corruption cover-up network on blast. What does that even mean? It just means he's going to make some crap up and say it a lot. He's telling you his plan. And he accused the FBI of inserting these human sources, quote, into these matters. Oh, no, not into these matters. Patel asked rhetorically, why? Why would you say January 6th? Because they wanted a political target, a political prosecution, not one based on law and fact. I mean, endless amounts of video of exactly what happened on January 6th and exactly who was doing it. And those people have been convicted, and when they are hauled into court, they're arrested, hauled into court, and they play the video, and they're like, that's you. And it is. And the jury can see it, and they say, yeah, you actually did something wrong here. You're going to jail. No, he's going to undo it all, you see, with the real facts that have somehow not been found anywhere in FBI files until 5 years later, or almost 5 years later, I guess 4 years later, and then if he's going to act on day one, I guess, and some change, all of a sudden the documentation that proves Kash Patel's counter theory, which has been debunked time and time again, shows up. I found it. It's in the files. Now that I've moved in as FBI director, I found the files that say I was right the whole time. That is amazing. The man who could lead Trump's FBI has failed to substantiate these wild accusations, because he can't, of course, which are contradicted, as they are, by other evidence and by common sense. Regardless, he has frequently advanced this conspiracy theory, using his background as a former federal prosecutor and public defender, key credentials used to buttress his nomination, to provide it with a veneer of credibility. I'm a lawyer, after all. You're a crazy a-hole, but, you are a member of the bar, and so it would seem. Below, that is to say in this article, we, the authors, provide additional examples of how Patel has elaborated on this conspiracy theory in his public appearances and his book. But first, we explain how Patel's conspiracy mongering was recently debunked by the Department of Justice's own Inspector General, if that still means anything to you. Patel is not alone in claiming that the FBI had a hidden hand in the events of January 6th. That conspiracy theory is popular on the right. In December of 2024, the Department of Justice's Office of the Inspector General, or OIG, released a report. It was last month. Does anyone remember it? Released a report debunking the conspiratorial claim that the FBI corruptly used its confidential human source network to instigate January 6th. I will say this. I don't remember it. It wasn't a particularly notable release, and it may be because there was a million other things distracting us from hearing about yet another report. But then again, you might be among the many of us who would just yawn at Yeah, I know. Another report debunking Republican disinformation. Whoopee. They're not going to believe it, and the media is going to brush straight past it, but okay, there it was. And then, of course, there's also the issue of, well, this might have been a little bit more exciting had it not taken you 4 years to produce it, but that's what careful investigation, that's the amount of time it takes to do that. And to demonstrate clearly that it's garbage, it's just, since it's going to be brushed off, you might have rushed it a little bit. It might have been okay. The OIG reports that it found no evidence that the FBI had undercover employees in the various protest crowds or at the Capitol on January 6th. No. Informants? Yes, not the same as undercover employees, though, and one of the easy conflations for Kash Patel to brush right past. We'll be right back. Hi, everybody. It's me, David Waldman. Yes, the same guy who interrupts you all the time. Interrupting you one more time just to tell you again, another reminder that your contributions are what keep this show on the air, and Patreon.com, Patreon.com, is still among the easiest ways to make the sustaining subscription donations that keep us afloat. Are you ready for the pep talk about how our Patreon campaign is still going strong and growing? Well, too bad. Yeah, the plain fact is we actually are headed in the wrong direction, and whereas we once had about 175 monthly patrons, we're now actually down below 150. Time to recruit some more. Not exactly the kind of news I wanted to share, but there it is. For those of you in a position to support the show, Patreon.com does make it easy to make those secure, recurring monthly contributions to do so. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. We've been through a lot together. The worst of the pandemic, we hope. The worst of the insurrection, we hope. So go ahead and treat yourself. You don't need an excuse. Give yourself the gift of a little something you enjoy in life. Support the show. And of course, if you happen to prefer using PayPal or even the Square Cash app, we're up and running on those options too. So thanks again, everyone, for all your support. We couldn't, or at least shouldn't, do it without you. Hope you'll be on board soon too. Thanks for all your support. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's continue through this Kash Patel mess, I guess. It's important. It's important to know, and it does have a January 6th connection. It's all about January 6th. As we were saying, the OIG report, 4 years later, finally says that it, quote, found no evidence that the FBI had undercover employees in the various protest crowds or at the Capitol on January 6th, not of any interest to Kash Patel or Republicans. I can see that. The OIG did find that the FBI tasked 3 confidential human sources, abbreviated here, CHS, with traveling to D.C., quote, for the events of January 6th to report on domestic terrorism subjects who were possibly attending the event. So, again, a clearer view of what happened here. Didn't the FBI have employees in the crowd? No. Well, you say no, but I mean, you were paying your confidential human sources. That makes them employees in my view. Well, it isn't the case. I mean, you're a lawyer. You know that you have to parse these things carefully. It's just not the case that these were FBI employees. But even if you were to adopt that simple shorthand, you would find that what you've got are people who are on hand traveling to D.C. with these groups that are suspected of already having an agenda for violence on January 6th in D.C., and you are telling us when they arrive and where they're staying and who's there on their behalf and which figures who are already being watched for their potential for violence are actually there and prepared to perpetrate that violence. But that's still a long way, miles away from, hey, I'm going to instigate this. How are you instigating it if those people have already traveled of their own volition all the way to Washington for January 6th at Trump's invitation? That's not instigation. That's observation. The OIG, like you said, did find that there were a whopping total of 3 confidential human sources reporting on this and letting the FBI know which domestic terrorism subjects were actually there in attendance. And 23 other FBI confidential human sources were in D.C. for January 6th. But again, remember the difference between FBI agents and their confidential human sources. You're talking about people who are involved and are sources, and the reason that they're valuable sources is they are, one, not FBI employees, and two, did not, in most cases, infiltrate these organizations on behalf of the FBI, but rather were already involved in these organizations and through whatever arrangements and for whatever reason have agreed to give the FBI actual information about what's going on in those organizations. Sometimes voluntarily, sometimes in exchange for their own, for inuring to their own benefit, getting themselves out of various other federal charges that they might be facing. But that's all they're doing, giving the FBI information about what people are doing on January 6th, not organizing it. However, the OIG emphasizes that none of these 26 confidential human sources, who are also not only the ones who were on the ground with others on January 6th, but the 3 who were reporting specifically on who was attending, all 26 confidential human sources, none of them was authorized to enter the Capitol or a restricted area or to otherwise break the law on January 6th, nor was any confidential human source directed by the FBI to encourage others to commit illegal acts on January 6th. It's pretty clear. It's kind of there in black and white, and, doesn't matter to Kash Patel. I'll show you the secret documents that were just discovered the moment I arrived here at the FBI offices that tell the opposite story for some reason, and with lots of misspellings, and on on letterhead that says FBI female body inspector. I'm not certain where we got this letterhead, but it appears there was some misprint there. Anyway, the old novelty T-shirts that they sometimes have, as Jerseyans say, down the shore for you to buy on the boardwalk. Haha, FBI. Well, all right. That's pretty much the same thing. You're just forging this as well. Simply put, the FBI relied on confidential human sources to provide information about the domestic extremist groups such as the Proud Boys, who definitely exist, and the Oath Keepers, who totally exist. The leaders of both groups have been convicted, as it happens, of seditious conspiracy for their actions surrounding and on January 6th. These right-wing extremists, especially the Proud Boys, were proven in a court of law. Remember when that was important? To have led the attack on the U.S. Capitol. But apparently, Kash Patel, former federal prosecutor and defense attorney, as it happens, who's played both sides of the fence on that one, and reasonably so, all of a sudden, a lot less respect for courts of law. Of course, as it turns out, increasingly, courts are being presided over by people who, in fact, have little to no respect for the law as it's been practiced up to this point in this country. So maybe we can sympathize. Next up, Patel claimed that he can prove, quote, beyond a reasonable doubt, oh, he's getting flashy, getting lawyerly on us, that the FBI was involved in January 6th. I mean, that is, if you believe his forged documents, then you will have no reasonable doubt. The role that the Proud Boys played instigating the January 6th attack has long been known. There is no credible evidence that suggests that they were somehow duped into storming the Capitol. Yet Patel has repeatedly attempted to shift blame away from when President Donald Trump and right-wing extremists, away from then President Donald Trump and right-wing extremists onto the FBI somehow. And also, I want to work there. For instance, Patel advocated for this conspiracy theory during a March 2023 interview with right-wing YouTuber Tim Pool. Brandishing his law enforcement credentials, Patel explained how he and others could, quote, defeat the insurrection narrative, unquote, by pointing to the presence of FBI informants on January 6th. Basically saying, the fact that anybody would tell the FBI, hey, this is who's here and this is what they're planning, is actually evidence that they were the ones planning it. It is not, in fact, evidence of that. You still need to produce that evidence, but you might just forge it. I think, as a former federal prosecutor and public defender who defended a lot of these types of cases, what you need to show is whether or not the FBI and government agents were using undercover operatives and informants on the day of January 6th. Well, he can prove that they were using informants on January 6th. It's just that statement doesn't actually ring true. I think, who cares what you think? Well, as a former federal prosecutor and a public defender, okay, those are credentials. What do you think? Well, I think what you need to show is whether or not the FBI and government agents were using undercover operatives and informants on that day. Why? What would that show us? Well, that they were. Yeah. Well, then, I don't know. Right. No, I mean, he doesn't say I don't know because that would give up the ghost, right? But what he says is, well, if they were using informants, then they're guilty of having instigated it. No. What you need to show in order to establish that they were guilty of having instigated it is some evidence that they instigated it. Well, but they had informants there. Yeah, but I mean, they had ice cream there too, and ice cream didn't do it. Informants aren't instigators, but they could be. Well, then show me that they are. But all I have to show, I think, look, you're an idiot, and I'm a former federal prosecutor and a public defender. You're just a moron YouTuber. Listen to me. What you need to show is that they had informants there that day. Don't you see? I've said it, with some stress in my voice. Oh, you strenuously object. Well, right out of a few good men. It doesn't matter that it's strenuous. Your job is to show that they instigated the violence. Can you show it? I don't need to show that. As a former federal prosecutor and public defender, I am telling you, I only need to show that they were there. No, I'm afraid that's not actually true, no matter how emphatically you say it. Should a person who has that kind of, let's even say, misunderstanding of the law be involved in the FBI at any level? No, of course not. Be director? No, absolutely not. But it's not a mistake. He knows exactly what he's doing. He's just lying about what needs to be shown, but saying it in a way that's going to make you say, well, maybe I don't understand why you would simply need to show that they were there. But then again, I'm not a former federal prosecutor or a public defender, so I better defer to this guy. After all, President Donald J. Trump, U.S. Marine Corps, which he isn't, says that I should trust him. He's the head of the FBI, goddammit. Well, Patel implied that the FBI's conspiracy was long in the making. Remember, it was at least a year. Why do you say that? I don't know. I just do. Arguing that it takes a 6 month now it's 6 months, a 6 month buildup at a minimum to place operatives or informants in extremist groups. No, it really doesn't. All you really have to find, it may take some time and whatever, and who knows? Maybe it even takes 6 months. Sometimes it's a year, sometimes 6 months. Of course, all that really happens in these cases is I'm in this organization, and I want, for whatever reason, to tell you what's going on in it. Sometimes for their own volition, sometimes because you flip them because they're facing federal charges of their own, whatever. But, it takes a while to develop those charges and then leverage them against it. Yeah, I guess so. But even so, it really doesn't matter how long it takes to do that if what's being done here is I'm asking you to tell me who's here in D.C. today. That's all. Even if it takes me 10 years to get to that. What didn't happen was getting you to instigate the violence. How long does that take? We don't know. This is just a red herring. Well, it takes at least 6 months to a year. I know that because I'm an insider. Okay, yes. And then what? 6 months later, you've got them telling us who's present. How does that show that they instigated the violence? It's time for me to leave, says Patel. There's no answer to that. It just is. It just happens. I insist that this is the case. It's not like they, the FBI, just dropped them into the Proud Boys and said, hey, go disrupt, please, Patel said. So once you prove that, then you defeat the insurrection narrative with the FBI's own documentation. Forget what the videotape shows. No, don't forget it. The videotape is actually, what was it? Pictures are worth how many words? Well, video must certainly be worth more words than that. But Again, this is just garbage. And I mean, you should be able to see through the garbage and be able to parse through it. I don't know why. You're never going to confront Kash Patel. But it's not like they just dropped them into the Proud Boys and said, go disrupt. No. And that also didn't happen and doesn't matter. But once you prove that it took 6 months to drop them into the Proud Boys under your theory, or possibly a year, that defeats the insurrection narrative. Why? If it takes a year to develop somebody to go and say, tell me what's going on. Do not instigate, but tell me what's going on. How does that suddenly prove that, no, in fact, they exceeded their mandate and instigated? It doesn't. It doesn't even come close. The only thing that they have in common is that the same people are involved. And in one case, you can prove that they were observing and can't prove that they were instigating. But if you can prove that they were observing and I say I have credentials and then say that therefore means that they were instigating, you have to believe that now. Why? Because I've said it on a podcast. I see. That's all we got. We know, he says, that the FBI were involved, and then he laughs. Ray Epps, Poole asserted during the interview. Patel responded, I totally agree. This is Tim Poole saying, we know that the FBI were involved. Ray Epps, who is, of course, the guy who was rumored to have been an FBI agent or informant who wasn't, but who they all believe was. So, we know that they were involved. Well, they weren't. And Patel says, of course, I totally agree. Poole hedged, but only a bit. Poole said, while he could not prove it definitively, and remember that whole court of law thing? They usually require that it be proved definitively. Though he couldn't prove it definitively, it looks like you have a preponderance of evidence. There's some, official sounding verbiage. You have a preponderance of evidence suggesting that there may have been federal law enforcement involved in making that thing, January 6th, happen. Patel eagerly went further. I'll get you beyond a reasonable doubt, Patel said. But Patel realizing that Poole doesn't know what he's talking about. Well, there's a preponderance of evidence. Well, that's not what you need. The preponderance of evidence is maybe what you need to get somebody charged, but not convicted. It doesn't work that way. But and then he says, by the way, do you have a preponderance of evidence? Can we just parse this again? No. It looks like you have a preponderance of evidence. For what? Well, this would be evidence suggesting that there may have been federal law enforcement involved in making that thing happen. Wow, you're still so far even from the preponderance of evidence. But it doesn't matter because the guy who's going to be FBI director says, I agree, and I say that plus what I have to show people that I'm going to forge and put in the files and then discover later will get you beyond a reasonable doubt. I'm going to find the standard that we need to convict people of having done this thing they didn't do. Patel claimed that two pieces of information supposedly established by the FBI's role. What does that mean? Patel claimed that two pieces of information supposedly established, there we are, the FBI's role. In reality, neither piece of information proved that, the role of the FBI, let alone the FBI's culpability beyond a reasonable doubt. What were they? First, Patel said Ray Epps was on the FBI's most wanted list one day, and the next day he was off of the FBI's most wanted list. There's only, he says, two ways that happens. You die, or you're an informant. I don't know that we're talking about the most wanted list here either. I mean, is that established? I don't know much about the Ray Epps story because it's not a real story, and I didn't bother to look too far into it. Now that we know, they've reached the conclusion. I'm buying their conclusion at the OIG that, no, he wasn't instigating, nor was he there in his role as an informant. So I don't know if I buy the most wanted thing either. But there are only two ways that it happens. He didn't die. I'll buy that. Or you're an informant. Sure. But are you an instigator? Again, the words both start with I, but that's all you got, Kash. But there is a third explanation that Patel did not mention. Epps called authorities when he saw that he was on the FBI's most wanted list. And remember, how did he get there? He got there because of January 6th. So first, like Patel's whole premise is that he was on the most wanted list before January 6th, became an informant, told people what happened, told the FBI what happened on January 6th as an informant, and got himself off the most wanted list that way. But he wasn't on the most wanted list until he was spotted at the Capitol during January 6th, it looks like. And then he got himself off the most wanted list by saying, one, I can tell you some things about some people who actually did stuff on January 6th. And two, I didn't do all that much anyway. And the FBI says, all right. In exchange for your testimony then? Sure, fine. So, Epps called authorities when he saw he was on the FBI's most wanted list. As the New York Times reported in May of 2022, nearly a year before Poole's interview with Patel, Epps called an FBI tip line 2 days after the attack, after he, quote, saw himself on a list of suspects from January 6th. Epps had been spotted alongside Ryan Samsel, one of the rioters who first breached the U.S. Capitol's restricted grounds. Epps told authorities that he, quote, had tried to calm Mr. Samsel down when they spoke. According to the Times, Samsel said much the same thing about his encounter with Epps. Epps came up to me and he said, dude, his entire words were, relax, the cops are doing their job, Mr. Samsel said, according to a recording of Samsel's interview with the FBI obtained by the Times. Doesn't sound so great. The second piece of supposed evidence that Patel cited in his interview with Poole was the January 2022 Senate Judiciary Committee hearing of testimony of Jill Sanborn, who was the executive assistant director of the National Security Branch of the FBI at the time. Patel described Sanborn as the head of the FBI counterintelligence division in charge of all these investigations. Patel said Senator Ted Cruz asked Sanborn flat out, were there federal agents involved with January 6th? Well, duh. I mean, flat out. Like, that's not even a good question. Flat out. Were there federal agents involved with January 6th? Now, I don't know. We'll go see what her answer is. But I mean, geez, I hope so. There were federal crimes going on. Anybody doing any arrests? Then yes. Then they are involved in January 6th. But I guess if you take it to mean, were there federal agents involved in the planning of the attack on January 6th? Okay. Well, she answers, Senator, I can't answer that at this time, which is a little weak, to say the least. But Patel then, of course, drew an unsupported conspiratorial inference from Sanborn's reticence. Now, if the answer was definitively no, having been a DOJ FBI guy myself, she would have gone there and said, nope, absolutely not. But I think we all know better about the DOJ being super careful about everything if there's any technical anything going on. Well, there was a guy who was a confidential informant but wasn't an instigator, and still it should not be considered an instigator, just did nothing that could be thought of in this instigation. But the question is, if I say no to that question from Ted Cruz, who's looking to get me, no doubt, right? If I say no and you say, aha, but weren't there informants? Well, yes, but you were asking about instigators. No, I never said instigator. I asked if there was any FBI involvement in it at all. And there was. And you said, no, there wasn't. Therefore, you are the one who's lying. You are the perjurer. You should go to jail. It's absolutely what the question was about. But it doesn't matter, right? So she gives the correct answer. Technically, maybe yes, maybe no. But I can't answer that at this time. That might need to be answered in a confidential setting, perhaps. And all that tells you is I'm not answering the question. But Kash Patel says you did answer the question and you answered yes. Or at least we can imply that from what you said. No, you can't. You can surmise and then guess about what her motivation might have been. But I did the same, and I came out at the opposite conclusion. It's pretty clear that there's not evidence there that you can really move on. Poole followed up. So you're saying that she said I can't answer that because the answer is yes, and that would compromise whatever their operation was? Too much. Patel responded, exactly. And, of course, it's not exactly it. at all. Well, I mean, although he might be right. Maybe it is exactly because Poole says you're saying that she said I can't answer that because the answer is yes, and that would compromise their operation. He is saying that. That's true. All right. Poole has it right. Patel just agreeing because it bolsters his position. But reality says that she says I can't answer that because she knows that she too is having a trap laid for her. That there were in fact informants there, but not instigators there. But saying yes will lead Ted Cruz to say you said yes to the question about instigators because he too is looking to conflate the two. So she said I can't answer. There was nothing nefarious about Sanborn's testimony, they go on to say. As she explained to Senator Cruz, she was simply unwilling to divulge sources and methods, but Patel led Poole's audience to believe Sanborn's testimony could help show, quote, beyond a reasonable doubt, that the FBI made January 6th happen. It does not. Next up, there's still more. Why not? We'll just spend our time on it today. Patel falsely asserted that Ray Epps was, quote, allowed to encourage and incite the January 6th riot as a government employee. Two very wrong and very improper conclusions. As part of the conspiracy theory blaming the FBI for January 6th, the MAGA right has fixated on Ray Epps, baselessly asserting that he worked for the FBI and somehow instigated the attack on the Capitol. As discussed above, Patel and Poole wove Epps into their retelling of the conspiracy theory. Patel has pushed his baseless claims much further in appearances, falsely stating that Epps was, quote, allowed to encourage and incite a riot around some of the events on January 6th as a government employee, was on U.S. Capitol grounds on behalf of the FBI, and was, quote, on the FBI payroll, and was part of the FBI's, quote, corruption cover-up network involving, quote, the illegal use of confidential human sources. What did the OIG report tell us earlier? None of that is actually true. Patel's allegations, documented more fully below, are not based in fact. In fact, the facts tell us the opposite. During a January 2022 interview with the House January 6th Committee, Epps himself denied working for the U.S. government in any capacity, saying, the only time I've been involved with the government was when I was a Marine in the United States Marine Corps. In September of 2023, Epps pleaded guilty to disorderly conduct on restricted grounds and was subsequently sentenced to 1 year of probation. During his plea hearing, a government prosecutor confirmed on the record that Epps was not before, during, or after January 6th a confidential source or undercover agent working on behalf of the government, the FBI, or any law enforcement agency. Outgoing FBI Director Christopher Wray has directly rebutted the conspiracy theory centered on Epps in congressional testimony as well. Nevertheless, Patel has alleged on multiple occasions, without citing adequate supporting evidence or documentation, that Epps was working for the FBI. And again, Patel used his credentials as a former prosecutor to lend the conspiracy theory the appearance of legitimacy. Look, as a former federal prosecutor who ran sources and informants, if the answer is this guy is not on our payroll and we don't know him, and he did absolutely nothing for the United States government, you come out hard and fast in your press op and say those things. Some people do, some people don't. But Patel says they all do. And he's told that Patel said during the January 6th, 2023 episode of Kash's Corner, but those things have never been said by this DOJ or FBI about Ray Epps. During that same episode, Patel called on the Republican-controlled House of Representatives to investigate Epps and the FBI's confidential human sources. Patel said the actions of the FBI confidential human sources on January 6th need to be the perennial? Why? Investigation. Patel went on to compare Epps to Christopher Steele, the former British intelligence official who produced a dossier filled with dubious allegations connecting Donald Trump to Russia in the lead-up to the 2016 presidential election. Okay. Do we even want to know exactly what Patel said in this? I know, we're running out of time, so probably not. As the quote shows, though, Patel asserts that Epps was acting on behalf of the FBI, and he wondered why the Bureau was allowed to implement multiple informants on January 6th. He wasn't, and they didn't, and that's all there is to it, really, basically. More examples are provided afterwards of Patel's continued nonsense and lying and intentional conflation. But again, we are out of time. This took a lot longer to read through because I had to comment along the way than I thought. Now time for us, in fact, to get ready to sign off on this January 6th. I don't expect any fireworks in the building today, although, again, I probably could take this time to remind everybody that there's still the open 14th Amendment question, and although the Electoral Count Act, the revised and reformed Electoral Count Act, makes it more difficult to raise actual objections to it, it might have been an interesting thing to do, to offer at some point, and maybe in the future even, to offer a resolution seeking to remove the 14th Amendment disability from Donald Trump, allowing him to serve as president, even though, Republicans don't believe that there is such a disability. Remember that it takes 2/3 to remove the disability under the 14th Amendment, and they'll never get to that 2/3. Even if Democrats offer the motion, they are not compelled to vote for it. They can simply offer the motion and withhold that 2/3. Not that that by itself would be convincing necessarily to the Supreme Court, or even if it was, that they wouldn't simply reverse themselves and say, to hell with it. There's no 14th Amendment after all. All right. Well, like I said, lots going on today, but no fireworks expected. Much more difficult to raise any objections, and no word that I've heard from any Democratic interest in raising objections to the certification of Trump's election today. But, well, interesting. Also, I guess we can note for the record, just because it's tied to the date, Politico reporting today that the DOJ currently still has 200 more cases that they are prepared to bring against January 6th participants, still pending as Trump prepares to take office. So in addition to the many, many pardons that he threatens to issue for people convicted for their role in January 6th, it looks like he can forever quash the prosecution of some 200 more that should, by rights, have been facing charges going forward. All right. Well, time now for us to hand things over to Justice Putnam for the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy today. He's got lots on tap, much more than we got to today. Although, thankfully, Greg broadened our horizons a little bit.
NetworksRadio.com. You have been listening to Kagro in the Morning with David Waldman.
Still, he does in fact lead off with a focus on January 6th. Trump and his allies in the GOP have flip-flopped, downplayed, and whitewashed the events of January 6th, and it's all by strategic design. We got into the nitty-gritty of the strategic design from Kash Patel, but it's Republican Party-wide, and they'll tell you how and why next. We'll see you tomorrow.